So thank you all for coming tonight. It's really great that you're all here. This show was unique and hopefully not unique in the future in that we actually were able to get it sponsored by generous and enthusiastic members of our community, including but not limited to Marcy Adams, John and Deb Spatafor, Diane and Pat McKee, Margaret Corshelli, Susan and Bud Dressler, and Julie Frankel. So I think we should all clap for them. I just want to say something about this show, and I kind of encourage this for all of our shows, but this more than others in a lot of ways is one to spend time with. So that's why we have the chairs in the gallery. I would say if you have time over the run of it to come and sort of engage more deeply with the written text and the reading area, I was able to do that, take some time and do that this morning, and it really helped to sort of deepen my understanding of it. And so if you have time, please do. And then if you're really nice and you knock on my door, I might make coffee. So I would just say that I think that because there's so much background in it and so much background in the project, I think a sort of deeper engagement helps to fill out your understanding a little bit. So encourage you to do that. On the 24th at the Bunker, we're going to have a movie night. We're going to screen American Revolution 2, which is some raw footage of the organizing that happened around the Democratic National Convention in 1968. So please join us for that. And then our next show opens on February 22nd, and it's a unique show. If you want a little teaser and understanding of what that's going to be, go to sharedstudios.com beforehand. And there'll be lots of emails about that. So please come. Dan is here, and he splits his time between Madison, but he spent a lot of time organizing and doing activist work, and he's a printmaker in Chicago, and he splits his time between LA and Madison, but we graciously got him on an LA segment of his time. So thanks for being here with us. And I'm just reading his formal bio, just because. He's a writer, organizer, blogger, print media artist living in Madison and LA. His texts have been published internationally in journals, exhibition catalogs, and book collections. His art projects circulate constantly in functional activist settings and through artist-run networks. For the year 2013, he was named a Fellow in Arts and Cultural Leadership from the Rockwood Leadership Institute of Oakland. So thanks for being here. As always, our program at large is sponsored and hosted by the Harold Jamie O.C. Trust, who donate to our program. So thanks for them for supporting our program.
All right. Hello. Thank you, Emma, and thank you to the college, because I have to say, on so many levels, it's so much more meaningful to me to make these kinds of appearances at places outside of the big centers of population. For one thing, for me, it's just an adventure to come to a place that is as beautiful and out of my usual paths of travel, like here, San Luis Obispo. All right, so what I'm gonna do here is just break down a little bit of how I work, and then talk a little bit specifically about what I contributed to this show, and then provide a little wider context of other examples of work, and then kind of bring it right up to the minute with some stuff that I've been just producing recently. And from there, hopefully that is maybe a springboard to some conversation with all of you. So that's my way of saying that, maybe, hopefully you could be thinking of questions or things to say starting now. And maybe you could keep time and just give me a signal at like maybe 30 minutes, 35 minutes, and we can get some good good time for some conversation, because that's really, in my mind, that's kind of what we really need to be doing in these kinds of gatherings now. Okay, so what you're looking at here is, I'm just going to show you these two images to begin with, just to show you, especially for the young people in this crowd, that, well, some things about my practice and my life and my interests have not really fundamentally changed. So what you're seeing here is this print that I did when I was a college student. I was like 19 years old. And that was in like 1988. When I was like 19, 20 years old. And this was, I think this was my very first time that I made something using letterpress, using, hand-set metal type. And this was a piece that I thought was lost. I don't think I saved any myself. But a friend of mine did save it and, put it in an old frame and got it in his house. When I saw it after many years of not seeing it, I kind of surprised myself, because I was like, have I not done anything new? So this is this stencil that I cut out, of like a double boarded cardboard. It's pretty hard to cut out when you're trying to make a stencil that out of the double boarded thickness cardboard, but it makes for like a really sturdy stencil, right? And this was for this art build that was sponsored by 350.org. Happened in Madison about a year ago. So you look at this and you look at that, and it's like, I could spin it, a couple of different ways and say that I've been blessed to find a direction and a purpose in my life early on, or somebody else could spin it negatively and say, maybe at some point you'll grow up and grow out of certain things. Okay, so there's that. And then there's what I primarily do as a craft activity in the studio. So even before that, right, my overall practice is kind of 50% writing, just conventional writing, and then 50% studio production. And in the studio, even though, do a little photography or a little sculpture, and when those ideas make those forms appropriate. But in terms of the craft knowledge, the thing that I have to practice, or else I get rusty, right? That's the craft part of it, is this letterpress printing. And nowadays, a lot of people do this. I got into it when it was dying out as a trade, and a little bit before I was really adopted and given new commercial life, like it is now, by younger people. Younger and mostly female, which is interesting, because I salvaged a lot of my gear from crusty old white guys, who were these old trade printers who were curmudgeonly, and they became printers because they didn't like people telling them what to do, right? So there was a shift there in the whole culture of printing that's interesting to me. And that's a segue into like, well, why is printing interesting to me? And these are some of the things that always fueled my interest in like, well, why would I want to do this? And you'll notice that in this list, aesthetics is not in there. And that's one of the reasons why, this has a new commercial life, a new sort of purchase on people's imaginations, because people want to have their wedding invitations, on kind of like pulpy paper with a nicely imprinted kind of stamped quality to it, and that's, for a lot of people, that's the attraction, that's the charm of letterpress. That was never really my interest. I was always interested in this question of like, well, why was this technology that was a standard technology for commercial purposes, why and how did it become superseded by these other faster, cheaper, more efficient means and technologies. So in there was this question of the logic of capital and how a logic of capital has in it this dynamic of producing obsolescence, right? And this is something that people have talked about, written about for a long time, really ever since the dawn of the industrial age. And I was always interested in this in relation to printing, because printing was this, the medium of circulating, the written word. So that gives you a little bit of the conceptual basis for my interest in why I do this. It's a picture of where I work in my basement. And this is the machine I do most of my work on, which is a Vandercook SB15 proof press. It was a press, a technology, a tool that occupied a very specific chapter in printing history, where people would set by hand their form, the thing they would print off of, the composition of all the letters, right? And take one perfect proof on this press, and then take that print and then march it down the hall to the photographic reproduction room, where they would take that print and photographically make a plate out of it, and then that would be the plate from which you'd print, a litho, through a litho process. You'd print, thousands or millions. So that kind of little overlap of hand trade work and hand crafting and skill with the whole photomechanical reproduction was kind of lasted maybe like 50 years at the most. But the one of the results of that period was the innovation and production of this kind of a press, which was a highly controllable press. You can do very, very fine, exacting work on it. And that's why this press and a few others like it are like the sought after presses now by artists who are doing this. So just some pictures of this actually happening for those who haven't seen it. So that's the form, the composition, right? The arrangement of all the letters. And there's the print. And that's a guy named Nicholas Lampert, who's a member of the Just Seeds Radical Printmaking Collective, author of a book called A People's Art History of the United States. Very good book. And that's the basement in drawing mode. This is something recent, just from last September, just to show you where this printing goes when there's an idea that takes it out of something that's flat and vertical and on a wall. So that is a old, disused, salvaged school desk from Chicago Public Schools that have been closed, and with the desk top being routed, and then me doing this printing and then making that or maybe I'll just talk loud. Making that arrangement on that design right on the top, and then with a piece of glass, so it becomes kind of a set of end tables. That's what it became. The French press is there just for scale. Okay, so that's what it looked like, right? So I'm cutting off the legs. Nope. Oh, and it's a pair. So one says loyalty to nation, and one says loyalty to school, right? And they have these little texts, text fragments, and letter play in there. And here's a picture of the installation on either side of a bed, right? Like these nightstands.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
Was that in someone's home, or was that a
That is in kind of unconventional art gallery called Open House Contemporary, which is it's kind of an odd, maybe like the leading edge of gentrification, one might say, in Chicago, where a wealthy person owns something like 6 like condo units in a building and rents them all out as Airbnbs and uses them all to, they're all furnished with art, with contemporary art. So that's where it is now. And yes, anybody who has a question about anything, please just break in and ask me. Okay, so to do a little bit of the dissection of this piece that's in the gallery, which I think probably all of you maybe saw, was the gallery piece is this poster, right? So the artists of the show, like we were invited to update and reinterpret for our times this idea, right? Organizing your own. Maybe you read in the gallery texts, where that idea or that phrase came from. It's a legacy idea of a moment when the civil rights movement of the 50s and early 60s started to lean towards a black power and black nationalist orientation. And some of the younger people that were part of that movement were becoming radicalized, right? And it was through that process that this idea came into circulation. And it was the curator, the organizer of this show, Daniel Tucker, who thought it would be a timely thing now when we have so much concern, obsession, prioritization of identity questions and identity issues to revisit this concept. And I'm putting this in quotations because I think to me that was really the question of what, to really break this down, what does organize mean? Organize for what, or organize how? And of course, this question of your own. What is my own? What is your own? Well, to me, the first thing that came to my mind was a subset of the. You could describe this population in a number of ways. You could describe it as a subset of the Chinese diaspora. You could just call them a body of international students from a particular country, China. You could call them Asian Americans in the making, because some of these students are going to settle in the US and become Americans long term. Anyways, all to say, it was this fast-growing year-on-year population of international students from China that I was interested in because, first of all, I knew that it was happening, and I was following this phenomenon that was happening in many campuses all over this country, and I had this question of what were they coming to, right? What country, what condition of a country were they seeing once they got here? And as a very small, little indicator of the whole cultural landscape that one might see once you get to the U.S. and maybe catch your eye if you're Chinese, are expressions of Chinese culture through this kind of a distorted process of representation in American society, right? And You could see this in a million ways, including just in incidental ways, like here in this packaging design in the produce section of a supermarket in Madison, Wisconsin, which I thought was interesting. Kowloon, which is the Romanized Cantonese name for a part of what used to be the territory of Hong Kong, which is now part of China. It's the part of Hong Kong that's attached to the mainland of China. It's opposite Hong Kong Island, right? And then yet it says produce of Mexico underneath there. And it's for a vegetable that people in China don't actually eat. Like when you think of broccoli, Chinese broccoli, it's a very different thing than this. Crown broccoli, right? So I had this interest in somehow using the invitation to contribute to something to this show as a way to maybe engage, but at least think hard about this population. Now, it made me think about my experiences in China. I've been to China about maybe 12 or 13 times now. I'm starting to lose count, but a bunch of times. And many times, ever since I went there for the first couple of times in the early 90s, not long after 1989, which is a key moment in the history of China, the crackdown of the Tiananmen movement, I found myself meeting and hanging out with really, really smart, really clever, really creative Chinese artists and intellectuals. But I often found myself in the position of just really wishing that I could show them what, to me, American culture really is, not the American culture they were getting, right? I mean, these were very, smart, intelligent people who had a very distorted understanding of the U.S. because all they saw was, kind of mainstream images and commercialized imagery. They weren't seeing stuff like this, right? And this is what in my evolution and political education, cultural education, et cetera, and all my various subcultural identifications, these were the parts of America, right, that make me proud to be part of all of these histories and these traditions, right? And I'm going to just point out a couple of them that are located in some way not far from here. So Henry Miller, the great writer, he lived in Big Sur for 19 years, and he did a lot of his great writing there. This is a picture, a photo taken by Hunter S. Thompson when he spent some time in Big Sur. That's him writing. I'll just read this. This is his words. This is the way life goes in Big Sur, waiting for the mail, watching the sea lions in the surf or the freighters on the horizon, sitting in the tubs at hot springs, once in a while a bit of drink. And, most of the time, working at whatever it is that you came here to work on, whether it be painting, writing, gardening, or the simple art of living your own life. And that's from Big Sur, The Garden of Agony from 1961. And these were my heroes. These were my sort of touchstone figures. The people who inspired me to reject a lot of my values that I inherited from my parents, and gave me a sense of a different way, right? And these are the kinds of the currents of American culture that my friends in China were just not getting. At the same time, in that period of the decade of the 60s and after, there were other, many, as you all know, many different kinds of social movements and different expressions of new social identities and so forth, including the whole emergence of the whole emergence of a people that we can now call Asian American. Like, that term did not exist in the early part of that decade and only came out in the later part of the decade in the context of social struggle. The term itself was coined by this fellow Yuji Ichioka. He was a historian at UCLA and an activist and an organizer. And it was brought into currency through a struggle in the Bay Area, a twofold or two-headed struggle. It was the struggle on the campus of San Francisco State in the Third World Student Strike of the spring of 1968. We're going to hear all about this, right? Because we have a whole year long of 50th anniversaries of everything that happened in 1968. So I'm getting on the leading edge of this by talking about it in January, right? And that student strike was, it linked, those student activists linked themselves to an off-campus struggle, which was the attempted eviction of poor and working class residents, long-term residents of this hotel in San Francisco in the historic Manila town. And many of those people, the residents, were, elderly, laborers, illiterate people who had worked all their lives in manual labor and were various Asian ethnicities. And in the course of that whole struggle, the student groups at San Francisco State University that had been organized under ethnically specific bases, like the Japanese American Students Organization or a Filipino Students Organization, they dissolved those organizations and they rebanded under an Asian American Students Organization. So this is all to say that when I'm talking about Asian American this or that, it's very much a process. It's not something that's naturalized and is fixed. It's something that operates in history and in historical circumstances and in response to political conditions. And this is what I wish, this is my desire to somehow communicate this to all of these students who are coming here from China to study. So this what you see in the gallery that I contributed, that poster, which I'll get to in a second here, that's just what you see on the wall, right? There's also this other component, which is this curriculum. It's online. I can get to it through the Organize Your Own website. And there's a reading list. And this is a little sample of the reading list here. And I wanted to show you this reading list because where I deviate from a lot of the discourse about difference, social difference, racial difference, ethnic difference, gender difference now is that I am a proponent of reading widely across difference. And I myself, I don't use the term intersectionality that much. I prefer a concept of difference within difference. And I think that reading widely across difference helps one to resist all the kinds of reductive tendencies that current discourse has. So I just wanted to point out here for all of you, myself as well, now that I'm spending more time in California, that just out of this sample of titles, I think I counted like 8 or 10 people on here that have an important, significant, California connection in their own personal history. So this is all to say that I think that if we're going to apply a geography to this curriculum that I'm proposing, California certainly occupies, a very significant place because this is where so much of the American counterculture really, evolved and emerged. But that being said, I will say the number of titles, just point this out, is 313 on this reading list. The reason for that is a tribute to near where I grew up, which is the area code 313, which is Detroit, which is the non-coastal, one of the non-coastal centers of American resistance of all kinds and countercultures. Okay, so at the same time, there is, of course, a great countercultural tradition within Chinese history and culture. Going back to the Seven Sages of the Bamboo Grove, which is like a kind of semi-historical, semi-legendary. It's like, it's unclear whether these were real figures or not, of these 7 scholar officials who, in essence, dropped out. This is in, dynastic China, like 700, 800 AD, before the capital was in Beijing, right? And there's a whole kind of literature, and it's a very well-traveled trope in visual art. You see 7 figures in a Chinese painting, the chances are that's the seven sages of the Bamboo Grove. And their whole thing was becoming disillusioned with the politics of officialdom in dynastic China, the cynicism of it all, and these guys just checked out, left, went into the woods, hung out, drank, just had their time with each other, and very great parallels to name your countercultural hero, right? Thoreau or whoever, right? This right here, what I'm showing you, is an example of a piece of work that came out of the woodcut movement of China, which was an appropriation, cultural appropriation alert, an appropriation of German expressionist woodcut applied to the situation and political circumstances in 1920s and 1930s China. This one's a little later. The reason I'm inserting this one in there is because this one was done by an uncle of mine, a renowned artist in China. He's still alive. He's in his upper 80s. His name is Yang Xianrong, and he made some of the now iconic woodcut graphics of the revolutionary period. Pieces like this, where this was in tribute to the women of the Chinese Revolution, where the declaration of a new China, a new society, new gender relations, the role of women is to cut off their hair, cut off their long hair. Right. Okay, so this poster that I made was kind of inspired by, first off, my life, my former life, I'm happy to say former life, as an adjunct faculty member. Where in my school and in many schools, if you're an adjunct faculty member and you teach, as I did, like a core class that's like run every year and like that's required, so you're guaranteed a level of enrollment, and then every once in a while the department chair does you the favor of allowing you to teach some sort of elective of your own design, but you have to fill the course. So you see at registration time, you see like faculty putting up posters advertising their course. like, oh, are you interested in, this kind of cinema? Take this class, So that was kind of the inspiration for this, was like a little commentary on this like modern, kind of underpaid academic labor, where you have to like, advertise your courses and market yourself or whatever, right? And then there's the other reference or inspiration, which is the Chinese woodcut movement, and applying this idea of American counterculture to that aesthetic and form. And that right there is, you see 5 characters, and it reads, 干嘛反文化. Anybody here speak Chinese or read Chinese? Yeah. So you do? Can you read that?
I was making a joke with myself.
Okay. Good joke. So yeah, 干嘛文化. Right? 干嘛 means it's a way of asking why, but colloquially it's more like, what the hell, right? When somebody does something surprising or a little off, you say 干嘛, like that, right? So 干嘛反文化 is counterculture. What the hell, right? And that's the dream that this person is having. So there you go, falling in a 14-week course in American countercultures for students from China. Also, this is kind of a backhanded critique of Asian American studies as a discipline, which at this point has, to my mind, has become a kind of political disappointment. I mean, I think any kind of ethnic studies really should be where all of the experimentation happens. And instead, it's all kind of like compensatory, what I describe as compensatory. Like, okay, you got your white canon. Well, here's the Asian American canon, or here's the African American canon, right? It's like, well, me too, or, okay, that's a different thing now. But, like, I'm here too, right? It's like, I'm here, I'm present, it's a kind of compensation for an absence, rather than a reworking of the whole idea of a canon, the whole idea of a university, the whole idea of learning, right? So this is what I think, like, Asian American studies as a discipline should be doing. Yeah. Okay, now, why do this? Why, think hard about this population? For somebody like me, right? Left-wing and, variously subculturally identified, conversant in, all kinds of alternative, traditions and countercultures. Well, we're not engaging with this population, but conservatives are. The only really proactive engagement by non-Chinese people on, say, for example, the campus of the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where there are something like 4,000 or more Chinese undergraduates, and that's the same with all of the flagship Big Ten schools now. It's like 3,000 to 5,000 Chinese undergrads. Evangelical Christians are reaching out because that's what they do, and they know how to do it. So there's a lack of recognition of of the need to do this, and that is what my whole project in this show is about, is proposing that and attempting to contribute something maybe actually practical.
FYI.
Okay.
It's a good time if you guys want to start asking questions.
Yeah, sure. These were taken from Jehovah's Witnesses who came to my door and somehow knew that I was Chinese, because I answered the door and they had these ready, and it was two white people, and they tried to speak Chinese to me. So there is this kind of engagement. It's just not happening from people that from my tribes, from my people, from the grassroots activist world, or the different punk subcultures or hippie subcultures, right? It's not happening on our part. Okay. Wider context, I'll just give you some examples of just other work where I'm just dealing with this question of difference and politics of difference. This is just a quotation from the Port Huron Statement, which was kind of considered like a founding document of the SDS, Students for Democratic Society. Was authored in the course of a weekend retreat in Port Huron, Michigan, not far from where I grew up. And it's interesting to me that in 1962, even though the language is dated, there are certain truths that were just put out there as obvious in terms of breaking down what the racial dynamic is really about. So much of it in this country is. It almost doesn't make sense to call it racism. To me, it's more like either call it, depending on what you're emphasizing in that conversation, either patriarchal racism or racialized sexism. Like they're always together, right? But these are all exercises in applying 20th century typefaces to 20th century language. So there's a little conceptual part there. This is a two-sided thing. The other side is in black and, in white and kind of a sky blue, the color of the state of Israel. And the other side says, he's the Israeli Bob Dylan. And this all came out just because I was watching television, and this was many years ago, and I saw this like daytime sort of thing, and they had these like beauty pageant contestants on stage at the Mall of America, and they interviewed them, and they were asked to describe themselves, and one African-American young woman described herself as the black Mini Driver. And I was just like, okay, I can sort of see that, but what does that even mean? And so this way of transposing an identity for description purposes, which happens all the time, I think there's something in there that is worth unpacking in terms of like how do we interpret who we are and who we belong to, what groups we belong to. I'm going to skip ahead then. Okay, let's just go to this one. So these prefigurative works, these are a set of posters. I think Emma's seen these. That I made for like I call them speculative history. It's like they're posters for events that haven't happened yet. Now it's very easy to go online and just do like calendars and many years in the future and find out what day of the week something is. And my idea was to print using old, handset type, which looks a certain way that you don't get from digital typesetting. These events that are happening in the future. So I was imagining, what would it really mean in the city of Chicago, which is a politically brutal city, for there not to be a woman of color as mayor, but a coalition, like a collective body as a mayor, not a person, not one person. And for that person to be running, for that coalition, for that collective body to be running for re-election. They already won, right? So.
Are you making reference to the Kardashians?
I could be.
That could be
Yeah.
That could be a coalition.
Right. Well, Kanye's from Chicago, so.
There you go.
I can stop there and we can just talk. Does anybody have something to ask, or yes?
It seems to me that our society feels a need to put labels on people, especially different types of people, and categorize them because that's where they're comfortable, you know? And I think that's where a lot of this stemmed from, and the different names that they gave people. And maybe it evolved over the ages, but I think we're still there. We're still labeling people.
Well, I'm okay with labels. I think to me what's important is that we understand that labels change. Or even if the word doesn't change, the meaning of that word changes. I think the labeling or the categorizations are, I don't particularly feel a desire to escape them entirely, because I can't really even imagine what that would be. Also, I see the utility in the categorizations because society needs to be organized somehow, even in our own minds, to interpret our society. You need some way to organize this incredibly complex body of humanity. And it makes sense to identify people as groups. What's important is that every time you do that, there's a politics behind that. There's issues of like, well, who gets to do it, and why, for what purpose, right? That's the lesson of this whole category of Asian American. There was a political intent in the beginning, and at this point it's become kind of generic, right? People don't think of the politics when they just say Asian American, but that's the history of it, and I think it's important to get back to that actually. Otherwise, it becomes fixed, and that's when it becomes a problem, I think, because that's when what you're talking about starts to happen,
Would it be more defining if instead of just grouping everybody as Asian American, say Chinese American, Japanese American, instead of just grouping everybody from Asia as Asia American?
Right. I think depending on the situation, I use for myself, I'll call myself Chinese American or Asian American or Asian or just Chinese. I sometimes it's really important, depending on a situation, for me, who doesn't, I speak pretty good Chinese, but I can't read. I can't read fluently, right? So there's a criterion of belonging that I do not meet on the level of language. But that said, within China, there are many groups who can't understand each other because there are so many different dialects and beyond dialects, like different forms of Chinese. So when you consider that, I think it's important sometimes for me to actually assert the fact that I am Chinese, just as Chinese as somebody who was born in China and had never left, right? And I think that can be, you see that with African Americans, with some of them choosing at certain times to call themselves or describe themselves as African, even though they may never have gone to Africa. Or what does that even mean? African, right? Africa's a very diverse place, right? So yeah. It's a recent drawing that I did. And I'm trying to, in this little picture here, this little drawing, trying to draw a connection between just the history of this concept of diversity, which really came into wide circulation through Darwin, not through any sort of social philosopher, but through an investigation of biological processes. But I think that you could retroactively apply this term and concept to lots and lots of the conversation and the debates and the conflicts that happened throughout the course of the French Revolution. Right? I mean, Mary Wollstonecraft's treatise, Vindication for the Rights of Women, which is right one of the great early, what we now call feminist texts, that was written in response to the conversation and debates that were happening in France in the process of the revolution and the debates over the rights of man. Right? So even from the beginning, in that time, right, so much of modern politics was born through what happened in the French Revolution, including all of these problematic, unresolved kinds of questions and struggles having to do with groups, different groups. You know, what group belongs, what groups, what groups can participate, what groups can, are recognized, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then now, we have in institutions such as the college here, or especially in big universities, layers and layers of bureaucracy. It's not the Committee on Diversity and Inclusion, it's a subcommittee, right?
I have a question, but
yes.
It's not super fully formed, but I guess I would just ask, this idea of creating a class that is talking about America in a way, and talking about American culture, is actually something that I wish I had taken, or because I spent most of my life internationally, and then I sort of entered into high school as a junior when I really didn't know much about, even though I didn't look different or really feel that different, I felt like there was a lot of just not even counterculture, but mainstream culture that I didn't understand or know. And I actually, this has come up in my own sort of performance work a lot, this, re-engaging of like me educating myself on like pop music or like, history or film history or whatever, just trying to feel like I could hold my own in a conversation. So it's not really a question, but sort of commenting more on this idea of sort of educating on counterculture. Is that?
Well, that's a great question, and this is a misgiving. It's a reservation that I have about even doing this, using a curriculum form, like a 14-week semester curriculum and syllabus form as a vehicle for delivering all of this material and all of this, all the products of imagination and imaginative living, transgressive living, experimental living, that I learned about really outside of school. And when my own daughter went through high school, and I was shocked. This is in Madison, Wisconsin, whatever, right? Progressive town, enlightened school district, and as a field trip, as a research field trip, because for a project she was doing in her like sophomore year high school class, was to go to the Waldheim Cemetery outside of Chicago, where there is, if you ever go to Chicago, the Chicago area, if you have any interest in radical history, you should go there, because that is where Voltairine de Cleyre is buried, and a whole bunch of anarchists and radicals. There's like a corner of that cemetery, including the Haymarket Martyrs Monument, and the final resting place after her body traveled in exile after she was dead, of Emma Goldman. And she was learning about Emma Goldman in school, which on the one hand I thought was great. On the other hand, I knew, knowing myself, that I wouldn't have wanted to learn about Emma Goldman had it been being fed to me in my sophomore year in high school, just because it was in a classroom. I was, the things I was really interested in, I was finding myself, right? I was discovering on my own. So I had that problem of like, how do you build into this project, into this like syllabus form, a way to a way for it to undermine its own authority. And I would ask you to go check out the website, because in the syllabus there's the section on grading. And I attempted this sort of structural subversion of the teacher's authority. So I'm just doing this from memory now, but I think I said, like, everybody gets an A, first of all, like, no matter what. And then there was a section there it was something where the students, if a majority of the students agreed to essentially nullify the authority of the instructor and expel the instructor, that, you know, they could do that. That was in the syllabus. So, you know, it's a way of acknowledging that even the authority of the instructor really, you know, should only be accepted as a perpetually provisional kind of thing. You know, it should never be. It's just like the authority of these categories. They cannot be. We have to resist the tendency to naturalize them, because that's when all of the trouble starts. Yes.
I'm curious about listening to your talk in the beginning, talking about the typesetting and your craft and your art, and evolving into the activism. When did it intersect for you? At what point in your life did you kind of bring these things together and start expressing your thoughts about activism and groups through this specific, unique kind of art?
Yeah, that was a process that started early. I have to say, there were sort of all of these proto kinds of elements that sort of pushed me in this direction of just having a general interest in politics, and a general interest in not only art, but like graphic art and letter forms. And I grew up in a house with, my parents had all these like Chinese paintings around, and I would just stare at these mountain water paintings or these prints that they would have that had these Chinese characters that I couldn't read. So I would just look at them and, meditate on these forms. And I knew they signified something, but I didn't know what. So very early in just sort of my visual vocabulary, that's what I was accustomed to. And then when I started to really latch onto things culturally on my own, as for many people, the most available thing was music. And it was through music. And this was in the days when I was, you'd buy records, and if you played records, maybe the old people here remember this, you could play a record and there was nothing to look at except the album jacket and the record cover. You could play the record over and over if you liked the record and just stare at the cover and really, really get to know like every little line and shape of that cover and think about it, right? And that led me to, things like psychedelic posters, and that's like okay, well, color, shape, and then from there it was all sort of that's a door to literature, to Henry Miller, to Hunter S. Thompson, all of that stuff. In terms of the politics, what really the specific triggers there were a publication called The Fifth Estate, which is a Detroit-based, no longer Detroit-based, but for many years a Detroit-based radical publication. And one of the primary writers for that radical paper was a teacher at my high school, and he kept it in the library. So I discovered that, and then I made the connection with this, Spanish teacher who came into one of my English classes and did as a guest teacher, and did a 2-week he taught for 2 weeks in our class as a guest, and what did he teach? This was like when, you know, in a senior year, like a senior elective. He taught the novel Nadja, the Andre Breton, you know. So you know, I was getting stuff like through my own discoveries, and then also having these happenstance kinds of connections with people who were basically like, you know, 60s radicals who were in, you know, by the mid 80s they're like teaching school, but they're teaching like really interesting stuff like that, you know. And then the same guy, he did for seniors at my high school, draft counseling. You know, like, oh, here are your options. You're going to get this letter. This is what some people do. This is what will happen if you don't return your info, blah, blah, blah. And my first big conflict with my parents was me refusing to register for the draft. And that was a kind of like open split in the generational divide between me and them. So that's sort of where the seeds of all that. Anything else? Yes.
I'd like to maybe build a little bit on what Jenna was saying, or asking you about. Is your connection with print as a political type of art, which is fairly pervasive in many cultures, and then your engagement with print in a digital age where print is sort of obsolete or its purpose is changing?
Right. And you just want me to, what my thoughts are on that?
Thoughts, yeah, or in connection with your practice.
Right. That is definitely a question I ask myself now. I came very close to just ridding myself of all this, you know, printing equipment that I'd accumulated because it's so hard to move around. And I felt like I wasn't using it enough. And you know, I asked my wife, I was like, is it time to just get rid of this? You know, I could, you know, there's a global market on eBay now for all this stuff, you know, wouldn't be that hard. You know, and she said, you know, I think you're just happiest when you're printing. Maybe that should be the reason you do it. And I kind of went with that. On some level, I have a hard time answering the question of you know, the utility and why keep doing something that doesn't have the kind of efficiency and convenience of circulation that all these digital, you know, processes do. That's on one level. On another level, I have come to value the slowness of the process. And when I was teaching printmaking, that was my first assignment for students, was to do a black and white woodcut. Nowhere to hide with that. And it's slow. You can't rush it, right? Forces you to think differently. So I think there is an answer in terms of an advantage of the kind of mental space that's opened up, the space of reflection, when one commits to analog processes. As for the whole politics and print thing, well, that's for sure, that's an abiding interest of mine, but I also have come to see the production of political prints as not really something that useful for real politics. And that's, I mean, I do it because at this point it's like my livelihood, you know, get invited to do it, to somehow get paid to do it, or to teach it. For the organizing part, it's fun to do something that will become part of the archive, and that, you know, you could go back and study, you know, for art historians or political historians of the future. But for amplifying and publicizing that event in advance, or to circulate and to amplify a political idea or position, The utility is kind of limited, and I've gotten to the point where what I do, this is a good way to end this, is to get to the last section here of the up to date, the up to the minute thing that I'm doing, right? Which is procrastinating and doing something that instead of what I really should be doing. So instead of the stuff that I should be doing for January 31st deadline. Okay, it's coming right up. Instead of working on that, I did a little wordplay thing and just gave it away, about 25 of them, to Facebook friends on the condition that they return to me a picture of the print somewhere out in the world. And that's the print. And these are some of the images that have come back. And I even hate to give this name and this person this kind of attention, but I hadn't seen anybody do this wordplay, and so on that level, it kind of demanded to be made. So this is kind of like, okay, I'm only doing an edition of about 30, keeping about 5 of them, and first come, first served. I just announced it to my Facebook page. I'll mail it to you wherever you are.
Is that one of your recent art? Is that one of your most recent art?
Yeah, December. This is from December. Yes.
Me?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Sorry.
If you have to, we are over time, so if you have to leave, feel free. But please ask the question.
I really liked what you were saying about reductionist politics earlier, and when you were talking about the logic of capital and how it produces obsolescence. And I was just thinking about that in a classroom setting when that question came up. I was a student at the University of Santa Cruz, and I really experienced that firsthand, like sitting in a classroom, and it's just a really uncomfortable relationship with the professor and with the other students. And I don't know, I was just thinking about like what you were saying about intersectionality and how that's a word that doesn't come up very often in your work because of its stagnant nature. And for me, I guess I was just thinking about like, I really don't like that word either. And I also don't like the word cis. And I feel like just like that compartmentalization in the classroom setting and the way that you see it impacted on students as a student and as a young person, I feel like it is something that, for me at least, seems like could be broken through with like this kind of work. Like in a classroom, seeing like the prints that you've been making all up on walls. I don't know, sorry, I guess it's a comment.
Mm-hmm.
Guys, it's a question. Sorry.
I will just echo your dissatisfactions with the discourse of difference on campuses, particularly. I feel like there's a real problem of non-strategic thinking going on. That's a game of euchre, by the way. So yes, thank you for that. I mean, like that's the things like I don't have a problem describing myself as cis most of the time, but not all of the time, because I don't know. I mean, sometimes I adhere to the theory that we're all really bi, or I mean, there's various ways of thinking about it. Yeah, I'm sorry, somebody up there. Okay.
I was appreciating the euchre.
Oh, okay. Anybody else? But this is, wood type, so.
Do you have any new ideas on your future art? Are you still continuing on your art?
Well, I've got this January 31st deadline.
Sorry.
So come the 31st, it'll be done. Yeah. And I'll just say, like, this is one comment. That's in Mexico City. I don't know if I've never been there, this Museum of Tolerance, but has anybody been there? This sculpture out front, but it's made from confiscated weaponry. Pretty interesting. This will be in that show, and I think on some level this is where I'm trying to push the conversation, because the reductive tendencies are one thing. That's half of the problem. The other half is the problem of attachment. Being attached to a kind of identity that's static, or a sort of understanding of oneself that is static, and that's a big problem. That's the lesson of Buddhism that we can apply to our politics today. Is why are we at all of these impasses where all of these people, kind of like within the broad left, can't even figure out how to work with each other, or train their criticisms on those closest to them. And to me, a lot of that is about not understanding the poison in attachment, in having this attachment to a kind of understanding of oneself, or one's group, or one's history, and needing we need to detach a bit from that and stay engaged. That's a contradiction of Buddhism, right? Compassionate engagement, but also detachment. You have to live in that zone of tension between the two. Yeah. And this piece right here, I know that there will be people who will just point at it, and if they discover that I did it, they'll be like, why are you putting yourself in a conversation about blackness? Well, I have, friends who are African American, who are Buddhist, and who are practitioners. What is the attachment to, who can say what about what, right? To me, it's more about, what's the contribution here to the movement and to the struggles.
And in many ways, that's kind of the premise of the show, in general.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So thank you very much. It was a great conversation.
Yeah.